this is the final part. We're going to have a look at the humanistic approach. If we have a look at the advanced information, just like the psychodynamic approach, there's quite a lot of key terms here that you need to be aware of. So again, these are listed in the worksheet, so make sure you can define all of these key terms. So we've got free will, self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, focus on the self, congruence, the role of conditions of worth, the influence on counselling psychology. So make sure you're aware of those key terms, and we'll go through some of those, and we'll go through, for example, the influence on counselling and the role of conditions of worth in a moment. We've also got a diagram here of the hierarchy of needs. So again, if you're quite a visual individual, you might want to draw this diagram down. You can draw the diagram in your exam if you want, if it helps you remember that information, and then just elaborate on that information and explain what you are showing in this diagram. So you can see you've got your different levels. So you start your physiological, then you've got your safety, your love and belonging, your esteem, and self-actualization. You don't need to remember the whole of the pyramid. Make sure you're aware that there are several levels, know the names of the different levels, and maybe a couple of examples for each if you're really struggling to remember the majority of that table. So we'll start with the outline of humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology claims that human beings have free will, so it's very different to the other approaches that we've looked at so far. People are still affected by external and internal influences, but are active agents who can determine their own development. Humanistic psychologists such as Roger and Maslow reject more scientific models that attempt to establish general principles of human behaviour. They believe that we are all unique and we should study subjective experience rather than general laws. So they use a person-centred approach. So the humanistic approach is very different to the behaviourist approach, social learning theory, and the psychodynamic approach, in that it believes that we have free will and we are actively able to change our behaviour. We have Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So that's the diagram that I showed you previously. This is a hierarchy of needs that motivates our behaviour. To achieve self-actualization, a number of other needs must first be met. So for example, we need to meet love and belonging to move up to esteem. We need to meet esteem needs to reach self-actualization. But to meet all of the needs, the physiological needs need to be met first. A person is only able to progress through the hierarchy once the current need in the sequence has been met. So I like to think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs as playing a game of The Sims. If you want to get that little diamond on top of their head, bright green, what you need to be doing is you need to be making sure they're going to the toilet, you need to make sure they're in a happy relationship, you need to make sure they're in happy surroundings and they've got a good job. Otherwise, it's going to go down, and it goes down constantly. It's really hard to keep that green diamond glowing above that person's head, because you'll be fine and you'll have reached self-actualization, and then 1 minute later you're hungry because it's tea time, so you go right back down the pyramid. In addition to Maslow, we had Rogers. Rogers developed Maslow's ideas further. Rogers argued that for personal growth to be achieved, and in an individual's concept of self, so the way that you see yourself, must have congruence with your ideal self, so the person you want to be. If there's too big a gap between the two selves, so if there's a big gap between your concept of selves and your ideal self, then you will be in a state of incongruence, and self-actualization will not be possible due to the negative feelings of self-worth that arise from incongruence. So there's a lot of big words in this. You might want to read through it. You might want to put these into some bullet points. In order to reduce the gap between the self-concept and the ideal self, Rogers developed client-centered therapy. Rogers claimed that many of the issues we experience as adults, such as worthlessness and low self-esteem, can often be explained by a lack of unconditional positive regard from our parents. A parent who sets boundaries or limits on their love for their child, and they have conditions of worth, by claiming they will only love you if, is storing up psychological problems for that child in the future. An effective therapist would therefore be able to provide his clients with the unconditional positive regard that they had failed to receive as children. So you've got a lot of key terms here. You need to go through that list in your worksheet. You need to define all of the key terms, and you need to figure out how they all link together. If we think about Rogers, he's really focusing on the esteem and love and belonging parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So they're quite far towards the top of the hierarchy of needs, and he's going into these parts in a lot more detail, particularly that esteem part. So we have our idea of ourself, and we have this ideal self who we want to be, and if there's a big gap between these, we're in a state of incongruence and we don't feel very good about ourselves. We have negative feelings of self-worth. We don't feel like we're worth anything, and we have really low self-esteem. So we need to become in a state of congruence. We need to reduce that gap between the way we see ourselves, maybe by the therapist giving us unconditional positive regard and making us feel better about ourselves and feel better about the way we see ourselves and to see ourselves in a more positive light. Or to give us a more realistic ideal self and think about who we are aspiring to be. Is this person we're aspiring to be realistic? Is this person achievable? And try and reduce that gap between the two. So the humanistic approach has had a huge impact on counselling psychology. Rogers' person-centred therapy is counselling psychology, and a lot of his concepts and ideas are used in modern day counselling. Rogers' client-centred therapy, or person-centred therapy, led to the general approach of counselling, which is used today, so for example by the Samaritans. Rogers saw the individual as an expert on their own condition. Therapy is not directed by the therapist, and the client is just encouraged towards the discovery of their own solutions. A therapist should provide the client with 3 things: genuineness, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. The aim of Rogerian therapy is to increase the person's feeling of self-worth, reduce the level of incongruence between the self-concept and the ideal self, and help the person become a more fully functioning person. Now we have some evaluation points. The approach is more holistic, as it is based on the idea that subjective experience can only be understood by considering the whole person. It therefore does not break up behaviour and experiences into smaller components like other approaches. So like the behaviourist approach reduces things down to stimulus response. This approach may have more validity than alternative approaches, as it considers meaningful human behaviour within its real-world context. However, reductionist approaches may be more scientific, and one issue with humanistic psychology is that, unlike behaviourism, the concepts are hard to empirically measure. So although it may have more external validity, it may apply to real world life and real world behaviours, if we're thinking about it in the context of psychology as a science, it's not very scientific. So it lacks that scientific rigour, and the concepts are really hard to test. Similar to the psychodynamic approach, we've got this issue with falsification. Strength. It's an optimistic approach, and humanistic psychologists see all people as basically good, free to work towards the achievement of their potential and in control of their lives. So it puts that person at the centre of their behaviour. It gives them that responsibility, but it also gives them that ability to change their behaviour. It's a very positive approach. It's unlike other approaches, such as the psychodynamic approach, which suggests that behaviour is determined by past experiences. This suggests that humanistic psychology is an optimistic alternative to other approaches. Then we have a limitation. The approach may be culturally biased. This is because many of the ideas such as individual freedom, autonomy, and personal growth are valued more in individualistic cultures. Collectivist cultures emphasise more the needs of the group and interdependence. In such countries, the ideals of humanistic psychology may not be as important as in others. Therefore, the approach does not apply universally, and it is a product of the cultural context within which it was developed. So it could be culturally biased here. We could have an issue with regards to us not being able to apply the humanistic approach to other cultures, especially when we're talking through therapy. Some other cultures may find therapy very difficult. They may find counselling very difficult because they find talking about themselves a very difficult thing. And the concepts that are included within the approach, even when we think about the idea of reaching self-actualization, this idea that to self-actualize, you need to be strong, you need to be independent, you need to be achieving all of these things on your own by yourself as an individual. In other cultures, you work together as a team, you live with your family, you live with extended family, you support them, you work together to achieve common goals. So the humanistic approach, even though it's more holistic, it might not be universally applied to all cultures. Okay, so you've got humanistic approach there, which is the final approach that is on the advanced information. Again, make sure you're aware of all of these key terms. Make sure you define them all. Make sure you're aware of the hierarchy of needs and the key parts of that hierarchy of needs, and a couple of examples from each of the parts. And really look at the question. Does the question ask about the influence of humanistic psychology on counselling? If it does, then you need to be saying about Rogers and his idea of self-worth and how that links to therapy and unconditional positive regard, etc. So really look at those questions, really look at those key terms within those questions. And again, although research methods is not mentioned in the approaches section, you could get research methods style questions in the approaches section. And although in the advanced information it doesn't mention the biological approach or the cognitive approach, you might want to revise a little bit of this in terms of evaluation, and you might want to use these approaches to enhance your evaluation of the different approaches. So even though there's not a specific question that in the advanced information it doesn't specifically look at comparison of approaches, they could still ask you to discuss approaches. So there's an example question on the worksheet, and that example question is for you to outline the psychodynamic approach and discuss the psychodynamic approach alongside the humanistic approach. So there could be some aspect within approaches whereby you need to include other approaches as part of that evaluation to enhance that evaluation. So for example, when we're evaluating the behaviourist approach, it's really useful for us to use social learning theory or to use cognitive approach. Or when we're looking at social learning theory, it's really helpful for us to use the biological approach, just to enhance our evaluation and provide better, higher level evaluation. So even though that these other approaches are not mentioned in the advanced information, you may wish to include aspects of them in your evaluation to enhance your evaluation of these different approaches. So have a go at the worksheet, make sure you define all of those key terms that are on the worksheet, make sure you have examples of the research, have a go at the practice questions, have a look at the mark schemes and look for those key terms, look for especially the research method style questions in the approaches section. Have a go at some past